This week we continue on our journey through the Pali Nikāyas as we return to the numerical discourses this time, to a sutta that we'll see discussing for us the reason for this practice. And it has to do with Nibbāna. And people's opinions about it, people's preconceived notions about it, as to what or how does it get to be reflected onto the life of the person practicing. And the sutta itself is from the Book of the Nines, from the Anguttara Nikāya, the Numerical Discourses. And it is from, the number is 9.34, Anguttara Nikāya, Book of the Nines, and sutta itself is sutta number 34, and it's the Nibbānasukha Sutta, the bliss that is Nibbāna. So you can kind of guess, perhaps, that this has more of a inspired utterance attached to it. The statement itself, the title itself of the sutta, Nibbānasukha. Sukha is the opposite of dukkha, something that we talk about a lot in Buddhism. Dukkha, which is the first noble truth, the realization of suffering. That's the noble truth, the first. But we don't acknowledge, or we don't know, or we even shun the presence of happiness as it relates to Nibbāna. I mean, the whole endeavor is for that, isn't it? The holy life, the journey, the ultimate goal of it, the main purpose for striving for the serious practitioner is Nibbāna. But here we have in the title Nibbānasukha. Sukha means happiness, sometimes also called bliss. I translate it as the bliss that is Nibbāna, bliss. We neglect to consider that. We avoid happiness, it seems, because of perhaps the many books, the many references we've come across in our studies of the Dhamma, maybe lectures, Dhamma talks here and there, teachers, people warning us to stay away from happiness. We pulling ourselves away from the practice the moment we feel somewhat happy, because we also know that there's connection in our mind, which is very primal. The connection I'm referring to is between pleasure and happiness. In this Dhamma and discipline, this dispensation of the Buddha, there's a clear demarcation line between the two. Pleasure and happiness are two different things. Pleasure, yes, will take us sooner or later to its opposite. Happiness doesn't have to. So, misunderstandings or misinterpretation is what usually at the crux of the matter in the person's understanding, or in this case, misunderstanding, which we will see in the sutta. Here we'll see Venerable Sāriputta, whom we haven't seen for a while. He's the main protagonist of the sutta. And for all newcomers, Venerable Sāriputta was second only to Lord Buddha in his wisdom. He was able to probe and understand, decipher, unweave the most intricate of principles of Dhamma so eloquently. So here we're going to see him express this inspired utterance and how his statement is taken, which clarifies or brings about, brings it to the forefront, if you will, of the misconceptions that even the bhikkhus had to this day, in fact, in many circles. You've heard me many times mention how when we come to the term parinibbāna, unfortunately, to this day, even the most erudite of Buddhist scholars, on top of that, monastic Buddhist scholars, often make the terrible mistake in defining parinibbāna as the state that comes post-mortem, after the Arahant has died. That's how they even interpret the Nibbāna Sutta, the state where Lord Buddha closed his eyes for the last time. So he went into a parinibbānic state, a realm type of a thing. There's not a single evidence of that. In fact, the whole Dhamma is against such a state, such philosophies. But here we see Nibbānasukha. Where can you experience happiness? When can we experience happiness? Here and now. In our life, in this very body. The term that we see often being used in many places is dittheva dhamme, in this very birth, in this very life that one is living. Lord Buddha did not teach the Dhamma to dead people. There is no resurrection type of a thing in our Buddhist teachings. He was a very matter-of-fact teacher, teaching a very matter-of-fact, applicable here and now teaching, which means that the ease promised must come in the presence of one's life, not in an after state. So I'm trying to put these as markers for us to revisit as we're going over, revisit in our mind as we're going over this sutta. So without further ado, let's begin. Anguttara Nikāya 9.34 Nibbānasukha Sutta, the bliss that is Nibbāna. This is what I personally heard. Once, the Venerable Sāriputta was staying at the squirrel's sanctuary in the bamboo park within the kingdom of Rajagaha. There, the Venerable Sāriputta, while being among his fellow bhikkhus, declared, "Friends, this Nibbāna is bliss. This Nibbāna indeed is bliss." You don't hear him speak like this often in the suttas. Venerable Sāriputta, that is. But he just made a declaration. We don't know how many Arahants were there around him, or whether there were bhikkhus who were arahants sitting around him, but we know there were bhikkhus, and we're going to see one of them speak up. And just at that moment, on hearing this, the Venerable Udāyi turned to the Venerable Sāriputta and retorted, "But friend, where is the bliss when there is nothing to be felt?" Basically, what bliss are you talking about when I'm not supposed to feel anything? Here's already a big misconception. This person has definitely not understood what Lord Buddha, or the Dhamma, is, basically, what Lord Buddha taught. Because in his mind, it is all about shunning and shutting down everything that is felt. There were schools of thought in India at the time preaching this, teaching this. And we see this character, Venerable Udāyi, before he became an Arahant, in many suttas. Also in the Vinaya Pitaka, by the way, where he's always throwing a wrench into, the mix. He's always the problem child. He's always coming up with questions or remarks, categorical remarks, which indicate his level of ignorance. This is ignorance. Because nowhere do you see Lord Buddha saying, or the Arahants speaking about us shutting down feeling. A few years ago, we did the last sutta from the Majjhima Nikāya, the middle-length discourses, if you recall, the Indriya Bhavana Sutta, where there was a student of contemporary teacher, contemporary to Lord Buddha, who comes to visit Lord Buddha. And Lord Buddha asks him as to what his teacher teaches to this student. And he says, my teacher teaches us to, when we see something, we don't see it. While hearing something, we don't hear it. We block ourselves from seeing, hearing, tasting, smelling, etc. And Lord Buddha turns to Venerable Ananda and says, Ananda, it seems that their teacher is teaching them how to be blind, how to be a deaf person. His statements are much more succinct and sharp, to the point where this individual visiting student from another school of thought, he becomes ashamed because he realizes how foolish that is. You can't be living, call yourself a living human being, and shut yourself. There are sadhus and things like that, ascetics and hermits throughout the world, especially in India, to this day, who practice such nonsense, thinking that somehow they are treading upon the spiritual path, punishing themselves, not feeling. And Lord Buddha's example there, it's such a beautiful, powerful sutta, Indriya Bhavana Sutta. So we see here a resonance with that school of thought, with Venerable Udāyi, who thinks that Nibbāna is a state where nothing is to be felt anymore. So what are you talking about, my friend Sāriputta, that Nibbāna is bliss? Because that's definitely not what I have come to understand it to be. And let's see what Venerable Sāriputta says. And the Venerable Sāriputta quickly replied, that's exactly it. So let me repeat Udāyi's statement so we remember. But friend, where is this bliss when there is nothing to be felt? And the Venerable Sāriputta quickly replied, that's exactly it, friend. The very fact that there is nothing to be felt. Now this is, to some, might sound very contradictory to what I was saying. Let me continue on, and I'll come back to this. it'll make more sense. And he continued by instructing the bhikkhus. Friends, there are these 5 strands of sensual stimulation. What 5? Pleasant forms picked up by the eyes that are enjoyable and lovely, driving one to want to look at again and for longer, provoking passions to arise and agitate the heart. That's the kind of feeling. Does it sound familiar? Earlier, I was making a clear distinction between pleasure and happiness. Do you see the presence of pleasure here? We look to gain some pleasurable experience through the function of the eye. And I think scientists have discovered that there's about 12 million sensory receptors within the body, within the brain specifically. And 10 million of those, overwhelming majority of those receptors, belong to the visual cortex, the eyes. So much information has been taken in the human brain, our brain, through the medium of the eyes. So we have a lot at stake. We seek out a lot through the eyes, and we enjoy seeing the pleasurable, and we despise what is unpleasurable or painful. And similarly with the neutral. Neutral doesn't mean it's happy. Definitely the painful is not giving us any sense of happiness either. Pleasure also. However, if that's all that we have to work with, we've come to interpret the results of our sensory perceptions, especially from the pleasurable doorway that comes in through the 6 senses, as equal to being happy. So Venerable Sāriputta is addressing that, because the key word here is sensual stimulation. Happiness does not depend on sensual stimulation, especially when referring to the 5 strands of sensual stimulation. Kama guna, pancha kama guna. These are the eyes, anything that comes through the visual perception, auditory, the ears, the nose, the tongue, and the body. If you notice, the 6th sense, the 6th one is not there. Because happiness, true happiness, especially in terms of Nibbāna, is a function, is accommodated rather, through the means of the mind, after all, isn't it? That's how we become aware. That's how we're practicing sati. So that's why the mind is supreme in all of these. But in this context, the mind is removed as being a sensual stimulation doorway. So it's not included as you would see it being included within other suttas in reference to the ayatanas, or the sense perceptions, 6 sense perceptions to be specific. So here, Venerable Sāriputta knows where Venerable Udayi is coming from. Because he's thinking, well, if I'm not enjoying my eye, whatever my eyes are seeing, my nose is smelling, my ears are hearing, what kind of bliss are you talking about? So he is now making a distinction for this other venerable. So similarly, so he just mentioned the first of the 5 strands, or sometimes they're called 5 chords of sensual lust. So now we're going to go to the ears. Pleasant audible sounds picked up by the ears that are enjoyable and lovely, driving one to want to listen to again and for longer, provoking passions to arise and agitate the heart. Have you ever heard a sound, a song perhaps, a melody, any kind of sound, that made you feel warm, made you feel glad, pleasure? Chances are you have. Countless times, perhaps. But what do we do if it's coming through the radio or some device? We usually will increase the volume, don't we? Because we want a little bit more of that. That's trying to sniff out more of the experience, to extract more of it, to gain more pleasure. Pleasant odors picked up by the nose that are enjoyable and lovely, driving one to want to smell again and for longer, provoking passions to arise and agitate the heart. This last verb, agitate, that is the problem, not the thing that you're looking at, the thing that you're smelling, the thing that you're hearing or listening to. In the Chitta Sutta and other suttas, similar, we have been presented with the image, the analogy, the metaphor of the two oxen, one being a white ox, the other being black. And they're joined at the neck with a two-eyed yoke. And the metaphor has to do, well, it's a teaching there. The Dhamma that's being taught is in reference to a question that has arisen as to, let's say, the white ox representing a visible form, audible sound, a fragrant smell, you name it. An object basically out there in the world that's going to be picked up by the, let's say, the other ox, the black ox, meaning the sense organ for that, the eye, the ear, the nose, etc. And the question is here presented as, which one is to blame? Is there such a thing that's to be blamed between these two oxen? Is it the white ox that's the problem, meaning the visible object? Or is it the eye that's the problem area, that's picking up the pleasurable, stimulation-inducing experience? And the answer is none. It's the yoke that's holding them together, and that is craving. Tanha is that. If you recall from the Majjhīya Sutta, which we've covered a few years ago as well, we saw the seamstress that stitches up. What? The two together, the visible object and the eye. And when they're stitched together, you are lost. The person experiencing it is now taken in the storm, in the hurricane of I consciousness. Because now you've dropped the position of the eye as simply being an organ that picks up certain sensory stimuli, and you've forgotten the fact that that was simply an object that was visible. It is supposed to be seen in the right circumstances. If there's enough light, if your attention is on it, if you're looking in that direction, and you have a perfectly functioning eye, that's going to happen. You drop that, and now what we have is the experience. We are in the whirlwind, the vortex of I consciousness. So this is where we have the sense of, this is my experience. The two pegs. Now you can actually play on this string, because if you're playing a lute or a guitar or a harp, it needs two places, right? To anchor itself down. Two pegs. We forget about the pegs. We're just now lost in the tune, the experience, thinking that that is the fullness of our experience. And we're there to simply enjoy that. Well, that's what we've been doing for countless eons, and we're stuck. We are listening to the music. We're listening to the songs that are they're kept playing in the mind between pleasure, pain, pleasure, pain, pleasure, pain. And this Dhamma is all about cutting ourselves free from that craziness, that pendulum. So again, Venerable Sāriputta is making a distinction between pleasure and true happiness, which he hasn't gone to yet, by the way. He's not explaining. He's saying, he's addressing where Venerable Udai is coming from by highlighting, putting a big spotlight on that. And then he's going to, once he demonstrated the falsity of his views, he's going to explain what he's trying to say as Nibbāna being bliss. Pleasant flavors picked up by the tongue that are enjoyable and lovely, driving one to want to taste again and for longer, provoking passions to arise and agitate the heart. Agitation that takes place in the heart is what we are trying to lessen, to make less and less and less, so we do not become so susceptible. That's why we are not being pulled into. You're holding yourself back from being sucked into that experience like you've always done. That's why we're here. You are inhabiting a human body because of the previous countless times that you wanted and you kept on having your heart be agitated by these 5 strands of sensuality. That's another way of looking at craving and why we get to be reborn and passed on from life to life to life to life with different identities, completely lost in dukkha. Agitation of the heart, passions, that's why we avoid them in the practice. One of the terms that a person experiences, and that's a good telltale sign that they are progressing in their practice, is the experience of viraga, dispassion, where passions fade away. The intensity of that emotionality is reduced drastically. But why? Agitation. You will not come close to even Nibbāna if the heart is still agitated. Being lost in some jhanic state is not remedy, is not the solution, because you're going to come out of the jhana, because all jhanas are temporary. That would have been just suppression. The agitation is still there, kicking strong, as they say. So there's no understanding, but this whole path is about removing such agitation. But you cannot do that unless there is a clear understanding, and that's why we're lucky enough to have Venerable Sāriputta explaining this. Pleasant touches picked up by the body that are enjoyable and lovely, driving one to want to touch again and for longer, provoking passions to arise and agitate the heart. These, friends, are the 5 strands of sensual stimulation. Now, whatever happiness or pleasure that arises while being conditioned and caused by these 5 strands of sensual pleasure is called sensual pleasure. So now Venerable Sāriputta is going to switch gears, as they say, and he's going to explain how to move away from this. But, friends, when the bhikkhu, by secluding his mind and thus no longer running after things having to do with sensuality, pulls his attention inwards and becomes quite secluded from sensual pleasures, secluded from unwholesome and bad merit-making states, he enters upon and remains in the first jhana, which is accompanied by thinking and pondering, while experiencing a strong flood of spiritual joy and ecstasy, all resulting from such seclusion. So, spiritual joy here is piti, which is different than any experience that one might have that comes to us through the means of the 5 sensory stimulations, which he just elaborated. The jhanas are different. The experience is different. Is it agitated still, though? Is the mind agitated? Some say no, but actually it is. The heart is very agitated because there's the presence of joy, even though it's a jhana. But we all have to start somewhere. A person like Venerable Udai cannot understand Nibbāna because he's still stuck on the first level, material level of 5 sensory stimulations. For such individuals, the jhanas can be a boon, a blessing, to remove them, to cut them off from being so attached to the body. That's why anybody who's interested in feeling passionate about the body, I've met individuals, students who were very sensual, interested in sensuality. Week after week, they would come complaining that they're not able to enter any of the jhanas. And I would say, well, there you go. They like to watch TV shows and things that irritate the heart, things that create sensuality. And that's what they're craving. Well, hello, you have the 5 hindrances there working against you. It's impossible for you to enter even the first jhana. Why? Because these are 2 different worlds you're dealing with. So one has to make a commitment, even in regards to the jhanas, compared to, in reference to, living one's own normal, sensuality-seeking, pursuing life. And that's why we have the term seclusion here included. In order for the person to even enter the first jhana, at least in the first stages of the practice, they must, it's a mandatory factor, prerequisite, that the individual seclude oneself and practice, not just from the senses, stimuli, but also from actual people and companionships, activities. Now, while the bhikkhu is in that jhana, if by any chance perceptions or memories pertaining to sensual pleasures creep in, trying to shake his attention, he immediately experiences them as upsetting to his practice, seeing those sense pleasures as no more than a cruel harassment. So the attitude has changed. The person had certain attitudes prior to wanting to enter the jhanas. So the relationship is maturing. One is becoming more mature in understanding the role of the senses and their stimulations vis-a-vis what he or she is experiencing now within that jhanic state. So while being aware, the hindrances will come. The person does not follow along the hindrances, doesn't take the bait. He says, no, you're harassing me, go away. Oh, we're going to go ahead and eat that thing over there. We're going to do that. Oh, we're going to listen to this after this meditation. It might be very quick. But the moment they lock on to that hindrance, to that thought, to that feeling, they drop down. They drop out of that state, in fact. No longer are they in the jhana, whatever jhana they were in. After all, friends, for anyone experiencing happiness or pleasure, when its opposite or pain arises, that itself becomes upsetting, a harassing and cruel oppression, which one has to then endure. It is for this reason, friends, that the Blessed One has declared how all oppressions that come to harass one are themselves none other than suffering. So there's this tug and push and pull going on, the tension that's created. So looking at it this way, it should be known and realized that Nibbāna is bliss. Throughout the suttas, you have statements made in terms of presenting antonyms, what it is not, basically. Nibbāna, what it is not, as a way to getting close to giving somewhat of a satisfactory response to people coming and asking, well, what is Nibbāna? So what it is not is a rather more acceptable term, obviously, because you cannot define Nibbāna. It's impossible because it is unconditioned. However, Venerable Sāriputta just presented here for the fellow bhikkhus a situation where there is this agitated state of mind, this restlessness, this tension constantly, and you're basically fighting to make sure that the hindrances don't dominate or don't even show up. So you're maintaining your ground. There's an ancient saying that says from Asia that it's a question, in fact, which one is more difficult, to conquer a mighty city or to conquer it and hold on to it, dominate it, protect it after you've vanquished it? To conquer it, to penetrate it, to destroy it is rather easy compared to maintaining it. So there's this push and pull going on. It creates agitation. And the more the person develops in the jhanas, for example, the subtlety, the sensitivity rather, to any kind of perturbance, any kind of tremor, any kind of tribulation, any kind of movement, no matter how subtle of an agitation it is, depending on how well they're developing and how serious they are to attaining Nibbāna, it becomes an extremely painful, oppressive presence. Even joy becomes a pain for such a mind. Even joy, piti, that everybody's craving to attain, becomes too much. Because the person is becoming more and more sensitive at noticing these tiny little fluctuations of oppression. The term is harassment that I used here. Cruel harassment, Venerable Sāriputta says. Because it's coming to pull you out of or from going deeper and deeper. Let's see what Venerable Sāriputta says. Again, friends, when the bhikkhu, by stilling his thinking process and without fighting with himself, turns his attention away from his thoughts by not engaging with them any further, he comes to experience the disappearance of both thinking and pondering. Vitakka vichara in Pali. Pondering, in this case, it's a deliberate effort at planning. Sometimes people go into meditation and they come out and they're like they've designed a new decor for their house during the meditation. I asked them how did the meditation go? They say, oh, Bhante, I decided this, and it's like all of a sudden they have a new plan. That means the person was not experiencing anything other than thinking and pondering. They probably never even entered the first jhana. Definitely have not entered the second jhana. In this way, he enters upon and remains, because the person is no longer vitakka vichara. In this way, he enters upon and remains in the second jhana, which continues to be accompanied by a strong flood of spiritual joy and ecstasy that are now the result of his growing and stable collectedness of heart, his samadhi. So now it's kind of settling in. It doesn't feel as weird or even kind of like in terms of one of the key prerequisites for the first jhana, if you recall, was seclusion. Here, instead of seclusion, we see his samadhi. It's like a shoe that you started wearing for about a few days or a week. It feels totally different. If it's the right size and everything, it's just like, okay, it's settled. It's like, okay. So you don't have to fight so much to maintain the seclusion. It comes naturally. Because now you're developing your practice even more. So now your practice is becoming, and your state of mind is becoming more subtle. Subtle. There isn't that much of a enforcing of outside conditions, because now it's turning internal more. And while the bhikkhu is in that jhana, the second, if by any chance perceptions or thoughts pertaining to memories creep in, sannyas, for example, trying to shake his attention, he immediately experiences them as upsetting to his practice, seeing those thoughts and memories as no more than a cruel harassment. After all, friends, for anyone experiencing happiness or pleasure, when its opposite or pain arises, that itself becomes upsetting, a harassing and cruel oppression that one has to then endure. It is for this reason, friends, that the Blessed One has declared how all oppressions that come to harass one are themselves none other than suffering. So looking at it this way too, it should be known and realized that Nibbāna is bliss. Again, if you notice, Venerable Sāriputta did not mention anything about Nibbāna. Again, he's using what Nibbāna is not. So he's just presenting to you, so far, jhana number 1, jhana number 2. And the problems related with both. And we're going to see the other ones too here. But there is this conditionality involved. Getting into, remaining in, coming out of the jhana, all have to do with conditionality. There's intentional thinking involved at one point or another. There's efforting involved. As you see, the hindrances will come, but you're practicing sati, awareness, sampajañña. Subtle work is going on to maintain a balance. It's like standing on a paddleboard on the ocean, and the waves are coming in and trying to dislodge you. So you have to maintain balance. We're standing against the wind without leaning onto anything, and it's a powerful gust of wind. You're standing at the edge of a cliff, for example, and the wind is strong. So you're practicing balance. It takes effort to maintain. Otherwise, you'll fall. That's not the case with Nibbāna. 3, again, friends, when the bhikkhu goes deeper in his meditation and without holding on to anything, including the experience of spiritual joy, he witnesses it to begin to vanish and cease. Thus he abides in a state of equanimity while being mindful and fully aware, still feeling a subtle ecstasy throughout, as he enters upon and abides in the 3rd jhana, for which reason the noble ones declare, it is such a one indeed who is serenely mindful, abiding in happiness, with an ever-present sense of equanimity. Now, while the bhikkhu is in that jhana, if by any chance perceptions or thoughts pertaining to joy creep in, trying to shake his attention, he immediately experiences them as upsetting to his practice, seeing those thoughts or perceptions about joy as no more than a cruel harassment. The mind is going to come in and say, what is this? Equanimity, it's kind of a balanced state. As like, but the joy was much more interesting. The fluttering of the heart and this and that. So I wonder if we can just dive into that a little bit more. Why did it go? Am I doing something wrong? Already you're dropped out. probably you're in the, if not completely out of all the jhanas, maybe you're in the first jhana, because you're now planning things, trying to figure out things. Vitakka vichara. So this is precarious. So there's a balance. It's almost like walking on a tightrope, which requires a lot of effort. After all, friends, for anyone experiencing happiness or pleasure, when its opposite or pain arises, that itself becomes upsetting, a harassing and cruel oppression that one has to then endure. In this case, it's the reference being made is, again, to the hindrances. It is for this reason, friends, that the Blessed One has declared how all oppressions that come to harass one are in themselves none other than suffering. So looking at it this way too, it should be known and realized that Nibbāna is bliss. Again, friends, when the bhikkhu gives up both pleasure and pain, and having already gone beyond joy and anguish, he remains in the continuous state of purifying mindfulness with an ever-present sense of equanimity, as he enters upon and abides in the fourth jhana, while experiencing neither pleasure nor pain, having now gone beyond both. Now, while the bhikkhu is in that jhana, if by any chance perceptions or thoughts pertaining to pleasure creep in, even because, remember, upekkha also has some subtle aspect of pleasure to it. Very subtle. But when you're reaching that deep level of quietude, where neither pain nor pleasure exist, remember, you've had countless eons of lifetimes where the mind was agitated. So now the mind turns to this state and says, this is not normal. This is not normal. Am I going crazy? What is this? I need action, plainly speaking. Thoughts pertaining to pleasure creep in, trying to shake his attention. He immediately experiences them as upsetting to his practice, seeing those thoughts about pleasure as no more than a cruel harassment. After all, friends, for anyone experiencing happiness or pleasure, when its opposite or pain arises, that itself becomes upsetting, a harassing and cruel oppression that one has to then endure. It is for this reason, friends, that the Blessed One has declared how all oppressions that come to harass one are in themselves none other than suffering. Oppressions here does not just mean things that are displeasing. Pleasures are included in the oppressive harassments, because they're the ones that are keeping us from going deeper. I've lost count of students, individuals who've reached out, wanting help, clarity, understanding of the Dhamma, who come to this point and they make a U-turn and go back to the world that is very familiar to them, specifically spiritual life that is drenched in sensuality, even if it's so-called spiritual sensuality, pleasures, feeling good, even doing good deeds to others is creating tremendous agitation in the mind. It gives you some fuzzy feelings. So many people go back to that world and they are stuck in samsara. There's no way for such a person to break into and attain to the first stage of awakening, Sotapatti. It's impossible unless they willingly, trustingly put the effort and in the right direction, which is the Dhamma, pure and simple, and let go of their attachments to sensuality, to pleasures, to passions. People have brought the thing about passion into spiritual practice, religious practice. Feeling good and feeling warm and so lively, calling it different things. Calling it kindness, compassion, sympathy, all these things. Even metta. People have a convoluted interpretation of metta or karuna. They don't understand. They don't want to understand because they have a loyalty towards feeling agitated, colorful, lively. For such individuals, Nibbāna is still going to be very, very far away. No wonder Lord Buddha calls it the other shore, the farther shore. It's not for the person who's very much drenched in the floodwaters. It's impossible. That's why we have the Noble Eightfold Path, to know, to have right view, and all the way to right samadhi. So the attitude that one has towards the jhanas has to be correct samadhi, because there is such a thing as miccha samadhi. So looking at it this way too, it should be known and realized that Nibbāna is bliss. 5. Again, friends, by having completely transcended and gone beyond the confines of the physical world and of tangibility, along with the disappearance of perceptions dealing with sensory reflexive contact. And by this is basically, we're talking about going beyond the rupa jhanas that are based on, form, the body, to the arupa jhanas, formless. And by no longer paying any attention to the multiplicity of unending perceptions, and instead remaining fully aware of how space is infinitely boundless, the bhikkhu enters upon and abides in the dimension of boundless infinity of space. This is where the outlines are becoming very porous. Outlines of identification, outlines of this is my world, your narratives, the way you interpret life, your identity, your thoughts, perceptions. So it can be very unsettling for some. Now, while the bhikkhu is in that dimension, if by any chance perceptions or thoughts pertaining to forms creep in, trying to shake his attention, he immediately experiences them as upsetting to his practice, seeing those thoughts about forms as no more than a cruel harassment. Because the mind, just like in the earlier case that I was describing, the heaviness of joy was something that the person was looking to attach oneself to, because everything else was too subtle for them to stay there. They were freaking out. They were being unsettled. They didn't feel comfortable because the person is so attached to their conceit, their ideas of how things are supposed to be. In this case, similar thing happens, but in the arupa jhanas, where the person is seeking tangibility, forms, specific dimensionality. This is what happens to a lot of astronauts if they haven't received the proper training. When there isn't, up and down, side, left and right. This also happens if you go diving in the open waters. Something like this happened years ago when I was first starting out diving, and they dropped us in California, Channel Islands, I think it was, and I looked down and I saw my legs suspended, and I looked down, there was nothing. It was just abyss. I looked forward, there was just abyss. Right, left, turned around, behind me, nothing. The heart started fluttering. I was like, okay, this is too much. So you need to calm yourself down. There's a lot of trust. The training has to kick in. Otherwise, if you're simply living in the world that is familiar, how do you expect to ever develop in anything, let alone on this spiritual path towards Nibbāna specifically? There's a lot of trust here, and that's another thing that many, aspirants or students of the Dhamma lack, and they fall out. They fall off the wagon. They go back, crawling into their old world full of dukkha. And there goes another life. So trust, like you keep hearing me say, the importance of trust is crucial. Not every bhikkhu over there who was associating with Lord Buddha, or in this case, Venerable Sāriputta, was an Arahant. Many of them lacked faith, but you have to get up in the morning, put on your robes, take your bowl, and head out to the city or village to go and, get food. And then come back, find a quiet place, sit down, eat your food, take care of the bowl, go back. Maybe if Lord Buddha is alive close by, you go and listen. But it's not that only. You have to do spend a lot of quiet time, relinquishing your preconceptions, which takes a lot of trust, because you are walking into the unknown. Nibbāna is not you treading into an area that is completely known. It defeats the whole purpose. Nibbāna is not a realm full of your concepts, or any concept for that matter. But that's what we have. Many of us have that as a prerequisite. Nibbāna has to fit this mark. I have to check this, and that's when I know all these boxes are checked. Yes, this is Nibbāna. That is exactly the opposite of Nibbāna. Again, friends, 6, having completely transcended and gone beyond the perception of space, being infinitely boundless, and by experiencing and being fully aware of how consciousness is boundlessly infinite, the bhikkhu enters upon and abides in the dimension of boundless infinity of consciousness. This follows, obviously, the infinity of space, realm, or consciousness. In this case, it's the consciousness itself has become porous. It's very fuzzy now. It's like you can't, there's the distinction between your consciousness and others is now very, well, it's not identifiable anymore. And that also makes people uneasy. Some people want to drop out of that state and go into something a little bit more tangible. That's why they won't proceed any further. They'll be stuck because now they introduce fear into the mix. But there's nothing to be afraid of. Their attachment to solidity, their attachment to the familiar, their attachment to their wrong views is the cause of the fear, not the jhana. Because they're latching on to their familiar world. That's why a student, they reach a point and they can't go any further and they come up and present other causes and conditions, and they usually blame the teaching, the teacher, or even in some cases themselves. That doesn't last long. Usually it's either the teacher or the teaching as the problem, and they fall out. Well, no, it's none of those two things. It's their adherence to how things are supposed to be. They lack the very principle of the Eightfold Path. They don't have right view to begin with. And everything else they do is wrong, no matter how many bells and whistles they put on it. Dhammic bells and whistles. It won't work because they're off the reservation completely. There's no samadhi. But samadhi is going to allow the person to go beyond the 6th jhana, as we'll see. Now, while the bhikkhu is in that dimension, if by any chance perceptions or thoughts pertaining to space, being infinitely boundless, creep in, trying to shake his attention, he immediately experiences them as upsetting to his practice, seeing those thoughts about space, being infinitely boundless, as no more than a cruel harassment. After all, friends, for anyone experiencing happiness or pleasure, when its opposite or pain arises, that itself becomes upsetting, a harassing and cruel oppression that one has to then endure. In this case, one might ask, well, Bhante, where is the pain here? They're in the arupa jhanas. What pain are you talking about? The very fact that the person is falling out of that jhana or not able to attain it creates pain. Now again, is it the jhana? What I was saying earlier, it is the person's attachment to the status quo, what they're expecting. So the inability to enter that jhana or to maintain that jhana, any fluctuation that happens, they take it personally. Even though they're, the consciousness is getting porous, as I said. But remember, ignorance is there. It's so deep in the heart. Avidya is very, very deep. That's why it's the very last sangyojana, the last fetter that comes off before the person becomes an arahant. So don't expect your avidya to disappear simply because you're entering a few jhanas here, or all of the jhanas for that matter. It is for this reason that the Blessed One has declared how all oppressions that come to harass one are in themselves none other than suffering. So looking at it this way also, it should be known and realized that Nibbāna is bliss. Again, friends, this is 7. Having completely transcended and gone beyond the perception of consciousness being infinitely boundless, and by experiencing and being fully aware of how there is only nothingness, the bhikkhu enters upon and abides in the dimension of nothingness. Now, while the bhikkhu is in that dimension, if by any chance perceptions of or thoughts pertaining to consciousness being infinitely boundless creep in, trying to shake his attention, he immediately experiences them as upsetting to his practice, seeing those thoughts about consciousness being infinitely boundless as no more than a cruel harassment. Why? Because he or she is loving the fact that they are in the realm of nothingness. And they don't like anything to come and shake them out of there. It's almost like being in a comfortable bed, covered up cozily. It's cold outside, or you have to get up. The alarm goes off, and it feels as terrible as that. But the attachment is the thing that's causing that. The ignorance is there. That's why it's funny when people say they are able to attain any of the jhanas, and therefore they don't have any attachment anymore. It's, grotesque. It's ludicrous to think like that, but many people do these days. After all, friends, for anyone experiencing happiness or pleasure, when its opposite or pain arises, that itself becomes upsetting, a harassing and cruel oppression that one has to then endure. It is for this reason, friends, that the Blessed One has declared how all oppressions that come to harass one are in themselves none other than suffering. So looking at it this way too, it should be known and realized that Nibbāna is bliss. 8. Again, friends, by having completely transcended and gone beyond the perception of nothingness, the bhikkhu enters upon and abides in the dimension of neither perception nor non-perception. This is the 8th jhana. Now, while the bhikkhu is in that dimension, if by any chance perceptions or thoughts pertaining to the dimension of nothingness creep in, trying to shake his attention, he immediately experiences them as upsetting to his practice, seeing those thoughts about nothingness as no more than a cruel harassment. This means obviously they've dropped out of the 8th jhana, by the way, because there's no perception as such in that, where it becomes, the person becomes cognizant of this, unless they are out of the 8th jhana. So now they're craving to go back to that state for whatever reason. After all, friends, for anyone experiencing happiness or pleasure, when its opposite or pain arises, that itself becomes upsetting, a harassing and cruel oppression that one has to then endure. It is for this reason, friends, that the Blessed One has declared how all oppressions that come to harass one are in themselves none other than suffering. So looking at it this way too, it should be known and realized that Nibbāna is bliss. 9. Remember, this is a book from the Book of Nines, so it's going to have 9 headings, 9 principles. 9. Again, friends, by having completely transcended and gone beyond the state of neither perception nor non-perception, the bhikkhu enters upon and abides in the cessation of perceptions and feelings. Thus, by having directly seen with wisdom, his heart's contaminants, the asavas, all come apart and are fully destroyed. So, looking at it this way too, it should be known and realized that Nibbāna is bliss. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. There is no fighting going on when the person is in the Nibbānic state. There's definitely no harassment. There's definitely no pushing and shoving and pulling and tugging. There is no longing. There is no craving for this. I wish it was, why did this happen? Like, none of that. That's why if you notice, Venerable Sāriputta kept repeating, for this reason, it should be known and realized that Nibbāna is bliss with every single one of those jhanas. And before that, he was talking about the 5 trappings of the 5 sensual stimulations that people take as the source for happiness. Now, many people, earlier I was mentioning this, and I think I said I'll come back to this. Now is the time. Many people look upon the jhanas and all those experiences to be had, subtler and subtler as the person progresses in the jhanas, as source of happiness, compared to or versus the 5 sensory stimulations or kama guna, lust-inducing. But the key thing to remember is the attachment. Nobody can be attached to Nibbāna. It's the very thing that has to be there in the sense that it's dropped the attachment for the individual to end up experiencing Nibbāna, which is free from all of these mental fluctuations, these fightings and these oppressive harassments. Now, something has to be said also in regards to what, well, this is one position that Venerable Udayi was presenting for us, right? That how could the Nibbāna be bliss when I can't feel it, when there's no feeling? Venerable Sāriputta guided him, held his hand in a sense, by showing him the different levels of feeling. Upekkha is seen often by many teachers as the ultimate feeling. Not exactly. Because as the person progresses, there's different layers of the mind until there is absolute clarity, which we here are defining as Nibbāna, the bliss that is Nibbāna. So where is the attachment? Does the person have attachments to something, including concepts? And that is the big problem that we have today. We have concepts about Nibbāna, all kinds of interpretations about Nibbāna. And it is non-definable or undefinable in, because it is unconditioned, but it is to be experienced by the wise. That's how the person gets to the other shore on dry land, stands on solids, true safety, without being touched by water. The water of the flood that separates this shore from that. But I cannot carry the stuff from here, from this shore over to the other shore. This is what Venerable Sāriputta is encouraging us to let go of, the way I understand it. Because we study the Dhamma not to collect new ideas about Nibbāna. If anything, ideas, less and less ideas have to be carried by you as you're practicing. More and more things have to come off as to what Nibbāna is or should be. So this is a path of humility that Venerable Sāriputta is encouraging us to develop in our practice, in our spiritual path. Instead of thinking that it's some attainment. And that's why many teachers have avoided even calling it an attainment or an achievement, an accomplishment. Some centuries ago, actually, even in our lifetime, in my lifetime, I've met people who were giving, instead of, as the case was in China and Japan, giving a certificate of awakening to students saying, okay, now you are enlightened. They were actually handing them those. You have that in China, you have that in Japan especially. But in my lifetime, I've seen so-called teachers giving verbal certificates to students. It wasn't me sitting there as the way it was in the university reading about this and going, scratching my head and saying, how could people have fallen for that? It was happening in front of me in my lifetime. And I was seeing it and I was like, now I get why people are so, they keep adding up. They keep coming, flocks and flocks. Well, why? Because they're being told that's what Nibbāna is. Well, that's the big criterion to know. That's the big clue. No one can tell you what Nibbāna is. If I tell you that this is Nibbāna, don't believe me, run away. Has nothing to do with your Nibbāna. That doesn't mean that there's different kinds of Nibbāna either, because that's where the mind goes, of the Putujjana. See how tricky the mind is? All of the Arahants were equal in their Nibbānic experience. All of them, including Lord Buddha and even, you name it, any of the Venerable Rahula, Revata, Chakkupala, Ananda, and perhaps you, if you practice the Dhamma, because it still is fully available. But it cannot be in the same vicinity as your ideas about Nibbāna. That doesn't mean that it is anything less than true bliss, the way Venerable Sāriputta was trying to convey to the bhikkhus. So there's a lot of trust here, but trust not in someone else or even the teaching. Trust in your abilities to constantly give up, but to persevere nevertheless. We have the tools. The Dhamma is simply a set of tools for us to practice. If you don't practice, it's like any toolbox out there, unused. And how do you know that you're progressing? When you look at your life and you see changes in your behavior, in your character, in your behavior, the way you behave in certain situations need to improve. In fact, the person has to get to a point where they say, I don't even recognize who that person was, because I'm living in peace and safety. And remember, ending up on the other shore, the farther shore, is not going to happen suddenly necessarily. No, because there's changes taking place in your life now. if you're practicing properly. Because some people still wait for that Nibbāna thing to fall out of the sky into their lap. No. There's work to be done by each individual. We've accepted that fact about every other aspect of our lives. Education, food you eat, the weight you want to lose, the weight you want to gain, the education, the degrees, the progression or growing in your status in society, in your position in your company or work, employment. All that required you to do some work. Serious work. Nibbāna requires the most serious work that you can output. And it requires us to be the most honest with ourselves. Because without it, forget it. Your treatment, your relationship to your job, to your education, to your career, in fact, in most cases, is much more sublime for you, more truthful in how much you're putting into that versus to what you're putting into the Dhamma. That's why I keep saying you cannot accessorize the Dhamma. You cannot fit the Dhamma into your own agenda, into the way you want to have it work, to fit your life according to your dictates. Venerable Buddha became an Arahant eventually. He really was, dense. It didn't go through. Decades had been spent. Venerable Sāriputta, Ananda, Lord Buddha had to teach him so much. I mean, I would say, wow, the patience they had. But finally, he became one. But how? Not because of their effort only, primarily because he gave up his stubbornness and was curious enough to know, to tell himself, maybe I don't know. Maybe whatever I've gathered is just a bunch of junk. Let me do what they said. Let me try. And this is where anupada, which is the opposite of upadana, you let go, you give up. But we're so loving of holding like this. Panchupadana, kanda, we hold on, afraid. This requires trust, the letting go, opening of your fingers, loosening them up, your grip. In everything that you do, this is basically what I'm encouraging here, suggesting for us to do is to be more innocent, to be softer, to be more welcoming of new layers of understanding from the heart. Trust. Not being so calculating. That's why Nibbānic experience is not something that is the result of analysis. Because all of that you got to give up. That's why Lord Buddha emphasized the importance of sunyata, emptiness. All that has to go. When that person, that Brahmin, came and slapped and hit Venerable Sāriputta from the back on the road as he was going on Pindapata, all the Dhamma that he knew meant nothing if he dropped back down to a part of a psyche that was functioning according to the old dictates, the old reactionary behavior. This is a very good lesson for us. If someone were to come and hit you on the back, or someone who would send you a nasty, nasty email, behaved towards you in a very uncalled for, hurtful manner, Can you be present during at least the very first few milliseconds with sati to compare it to the Dhamma and what the Dhamma requires from you to greet that situation with? Application, that's what I'm talking about. So include the Dhamma, bring the Dhamma into your life more and more, more and more, more and more, and that will allow us to become more humble and practicing of it. Because Nibbāna is the result of such practice, nothing else. That's how I understand it. So I will pause here and see if there are any questions. Well, if there are none, let us transfer some merits. Akasatha chabumata devanagamahiddhika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakhantu lokasasanam. Akasatha chabumata devanagamahiddhika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakhantu desanam. Akasatha chabumata devanagamahiddhika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakhantu manvaranti. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Be kind. Be generous with yourselves. Be soft. Persevere. We're quite fortunate to be alive in this body at this time period, despite whatever's happening in the world around us. We're very fortunate to have the Dhamma, because there's so many countless people who don't have it, don't come across it, are not even interested in the Dhamma. Just like at the time of Lord Buddha. There were people who were probably seeing Lord Buddha pass by their street on Pindapada, never even felt the need to bow, never felt the need to put a morsel of some rice or something in their bowl, never even cared to look at Lord Buddha. Wasted opportunity. So we have the Dhamma now in this body, and we're so fortunate to have a human body that works, that is able to process. So make this work really fruitful. We still have a few more days left for this year. You can accomplish a lot. Venerable Ananda was pushed by his half-brother, and Venerable Mahakassapa. You could do it, you could do it, you could do it. Right before the first council. And lo and behold, he did attain arahantship. So, and the new year is around the corner, so long as we're alive, but let us not count on that all the time, that we have the future, we have the future. Otherwise, we're going to be deluded like so many people, that I have another life where I have the future, I have, Tusita realm to go to, and no. Now, the Teva Dhamme, your blood is rushing through your capillaries, your veins, your arteries. You're able to hear, you're able to sit, you're able to become full of sati and sampajañña. And that's all you need as you're practicing your sīla, becoming impeccable, pure. That's what the Dhamma needs. Until next time, be strong, practicing. May the Triple Gems blessings be with you all and your loved ones. Sukhi Hotu.